Right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Geoff Sloan. I'm one of the co-directors of the Ways of Warfare Centre here at the University of Reading. It's a great pleasure to welcome as our first guest speaker for this term, the Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood MP. I will give him a full introduction in a minute, but first of all, let me welcome a number of people from different sort of constituencies that we're hoping to reach out to today. So first of all, a great welcome to our academic colleagues from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. I'd also like to extend a real welcome to our students from the Army Higher Education Pathway. This is the first time we've made this seminar series available to you all. I hope you enjoy it and get something from it. I'd also like to welcome our undergraduates, our master's students, and our doctoral students. One of the things that the department has tried to do is to reach out to HM forces and indeed retired officers through postgraduate activity. We have a number of serving Army officers who are doing part-time doctorates with us. We've also acquired perhaps our most senior retired officer, Air Chief Marshal Sir Brian Burridge has just started with us as a doctoral student this autumn. One of the things I'd like to do now is to tell you a little bit about the kind of the format before I introduce our speaker. So he's going to talk for about 20-25 minutes and then have a series, hopefully a very sort of vigorous sort of question and answer session. I'd also like to inform everybody that this session is being recorded so people can use it and it's available to be distributed. The theme is going to be Global Britain. So let me come to the introduction of our guest speaker, Tobias Ellwood. He was first elected as a Member of Parliament for Bournemouth East in 2005, and he has served in the role of Opposition Whip. He's been Shadow Minister of Culture, Media and Sport. He's been Parliamentary Private Secretary to Liam Fox and David Lidington, and in July 2014 he was promoted to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office as Minister for the Middle East and Africa. He then moved to the Ministry of Defence as Minister for Defence, People and Veterans, and Tobias Ellwood was elected Chair of the Defence Select Committee in January 2020. He also spent 6 years serving in the regular army with the Royal Green Jackets, and now holds the rank of Lieutenant Colonel as a reservist with 77 Brigade. So we're very lucky that we have someone who is really well qualified to address the theme of Global Britain today. Tobias, over to you.
Well, Geoff, thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be joining you this afternoon. And I think there's quite a diverse crowd who are tuning in your description there. So really pleased to be able to talk about something which is very, very important to me. Thank you for reading out my CV. It's always worrying when your entire life is summarized in about 50 seconds. But nevertheless, the reason why I was drawn to politics is because I very much come from an international background. My father worked for the United Nations. I was born in New York. I'm a dual national. And I felt it was important to try and understand a little bit about the wider world. It was even at a younger age, I was recognizing that the world is getting more complicated and tensions were rising. And unsure what to do after I left university, I decided to join the armed forces. And there I really saw the competence, the professionalism, the reputation of the British Armed Forces, but also perhaps a very interesting role that Britain can continue to play on the international stage, bearing in mind what a tiny, small island we actually are. Now, of course, we've not always been so small, metaphorically speaking. It's because of our history that we now sit at the crossroads of so many important organizations that we actually helped to create in the first place. the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Commonwealth itself, the G7 group of nations, the Five Eyes community, and of course we have that seat, a permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. Now, this is all down to our history. It's down to the connectivity that we've had across the world, but also down, I think, to some degree, to the courage that Britain exhibited in the last century, when a couple times we stepped forward as a force for good, perhaps when other nations, hesitated. And since then, it's been part of our DNA, if you like, to try and grasp what is going on around the world and to participate in it as an active, influencer. And certainly in Parliament, that list of organizations that we can proudly state that we are part of is regularly read out in any debate on foreign affairs. But sometimes I think we do that perhaps in denial as about where the world is really going. It's almost we say these things to really convince ourselves that we walk tall on the international stage with the same sense of swagger. But I will be, the first to say that, whilst we yield that influence to some degree, the foundations are still remaining very, very strong. We still participate in these international organizations, although we've left the European Union. Our diplomatic reach, of course, is strong. Our armed forces are arguably the best in the world, as indeed our intelligence services. And yes, our soft power is still respected. We're trusted. We have no hidden agendas, and we're not corrupt. We can offer solutions, and we can understand the world. My concern is that given the status that UK finds itself on the international stage, we are not maximizing this unique position of influence that we have built up over decades, indeed over centuries. I'd go even further to say, and this has been reflected a little bit in this year, in the year 2021, there's a growing absence of appetite to, in fact, to lead, to step forward and to take the initiative, perhaps hesitating to allow others to take lead or to see where things will actually go. It isn't just Britain, I should make this very, very clear. It is actually the West as a whole. You look back over this last decade that we've had, we arguably have lost sight from a Western perspective as to what we actually stand for. What does the West stand for? What do we actually believe in? What are we really willing to defend? I attended the Munich Security Conference, which is one of the biggest European security conferences that there are. Back in 2020, they actually had the title of the conference that year was called Westlessness, this absence of an identity as to what we now actually all lean towards. It was very clear during the Cold War. There was a single adversary. After 9/11, when those events suddenly came into the world where there was a new aggressor form, we did all lean into the same direction. But we're in a very confusing, ambiguous place at the moment. And that is a critical point for us to ask ourselves as to what our role is on the international stage. And I would say that we are entering a new era of complex and ever-growing threats. They are not getting any easier, but we're not getting any better to try and solve them. Indeed, Britain has been distracted by Brexit. It's been a painful few years here in Parliament as the nation was divided right down the middle with that. And it continues, as we've seen over the debates, over the lorry drivers and so forth, to cause frustration and division as well. Don't want to go any further down that particular rabbit hole. Making Brexit work is something that I think all parties now want to lean towards. But nevertheless, it's distracted us from what's going on in the bigger picture. It's been seen from the outside as us perhaps retreating into the little England. And you then need to contest that. You need to convince other people that that isn't the case. And of course, there is the pandemic that's seen the world become more siloed, more protectionist, more populist, with nations retreating from the global stage. And that's ever more taking place simply because of the supply chains and so forth. So my key message today is that the world is on a dangerous trajectory, and we need to wake up. I pose this question to you all that are listening, watching today. Do you think the world will be a more safer or less safer place in 5 years' time? Now, that's the exact question that I asked the Prime Minister. I chair the Defence Select Committee, and all the chairs of all the select committees get together about every 6 weeks, and the Prime Minister comes in front of us and we all get to ask a few questions. And that was the exact question I asked the Prime Minister. This was actually before Afghanistan and before the crisis, the COVID crisis, are really sort of kicked in. And he agreed that yes, things were getting more difficult, more challenging, but nevertheless, he refused to acknowledge that there was a case to change our defence spending, which is currently at 2.2 GDP. Now, during the Cold War, it was at 4%. And I would argue, and I will try and make the case today, that when you add up all the challenges that we are looking at today, that we are facing greater threats, even though it's not a singular threat, than during the Cold War when we spent 4%. So I'm arguing for an increase in defence spending to at least 3% to get ourselves prepared for what could be coming over the horizon. My concern is that we are collectively in denial about what potentially is coming around the corner. There is no effort to sort of win over the nation, if you like, to help justify improving our defence posture, because you're only going to do it, you're only going to get a commitment to increase defence spending as opposed to transport or local government or all the other, health, for example, like that, if you make the case and the taxpayers actually support it. And we're not even going down that avenue. We're not even trying to actually convince the nation that is the case. Government policy, understandably, is very domestically focused. Now, we have to recognize that you secure votes, it helps you stay in office. And if you're able to improve people's lives directly all the times, you're more likely to then gain their support at the elections itself. And right now, budgets are tight because of the COVID-19, our response to the pandemic. We spent £400 billion we never anticipated to. All departments are now crying out for money. And spending overseas is not necessarily a vote winner, particularly when you can't see the threats, when they don't really transpire into your everyday lives. And indeed, cutting overseas aid spend actually has been promoted by this government as a vote winner. The red wall seats up in the north of England, that's where the money will go. Therefore, absolutely, let's cut back on what we're doing without clarifying or spelling out the consequences of us withdrawing from those projects across Africa and across Asia. Because when you do withdraw those projects, then you actually affect lives. People can die from the fact that you have stopped programs which were maintaining the peace, which were keeping people alive through humanitarian support. And if you're doing some work in Libya, for example, and you pull your British teams out, they could be replaced by Russia or China, and they will have a very different agenda to pursue than our more transparent one that I touched on earlier. And the first duty of any government, I would argue, is actually security of the nation. And that is certainly the position I sit at as chair of the Defence Select Committee. It would be remiss of me not to call out the fact that right now there is a very 1930s feel to the world at the moment, a global economic downturn that we're experiencing, lack of Western leadership, growing authoritarianism, nations starting to rearm. Now, to add to that, we've got Russian adventurism. We have the phenomenal rise in assertiveness of China. And we have extremism expanding well beyond the Middle East. We may have dealt with the caliphate, but by no means is jihadi extremism absolutely removed. It's very much there, spilling into Africa and now back in Afghanistan, as we know. So the rise of non-state actors as well, playing an influential role. And new technology is actually changing the character of war, of conflict, of war. It's giving new players the ability to cause harm in different ways. And if that wasn't enough, we then have climate change, which is obviously very much front and center of everybody's lives. But we don't, when talking about climate change, actually look at it from a security perspective, because there are huge security implications of the consequences of climate change. When sea levels rise, people then have to move. Where are they going to move to? If deserts expand out and take over crops and so on, there'll be food and water shortages. There will be mass migration, particularly in Africa. Africa is going to have only 1/5 of the jobs for the people there as that population grows. Where will all those people go? Well, they're going to head towards Europe, and we're not even starting to get our head around all that. And the comparison with the 1930s is really that also that our international organizations are unable to hold our nations to account, successfully coordinate other nations, like-minded bodies, to successfully bring actions against international challenges that impact us all. And whether they be adversaries or indeed even cutting CO2 emissions, it's proving hard work to get everybody agree to those. China is being patted on the back for not building any more coal-fired power stations. Actually, they're not building any more abroad. They're still building them in their own country. And coordination of COVID vaccines, it's been minimalist, if we're really honest about it. Whilst we are pleased that we're now on our third vaccine for most people, there are many people, more people across the world, still need to receive their first vaccine. So that effort to work together has been tested in these difficult times. So the West is divided, it's distracted, and indeed we end up competing with each other sometimes as well. And this actually gives license to our adversaries to celebrate. They're pleased to see us go head to head against each other. And they, of course, can then step in to exploit those differences as well. We need to wake up and recognize that big international geopolitics is back with a vengeance after perhaps what we could call a post-Cold War holiday. So with a massive void in Western leadership, I want Britain to fill it. That's the positive side here. I think by the reasons I said earlier, that our strengths that we have are still there. But in also to do so, we need to acknowledge that the world is changing fast. If we don't upgrade our rules-based order over the next 5 years, it will have significant implications to how the next 5 decades actually unfold. Such are the growing challenges that we face. I make it very, very clear, specifically from China itself. If we don't agree the terms and conditions in which China is going to grow, we will miss the boat, and they will continue pursuing their agenda. And that can easily see the world splinter into 2 spheres of influence, with China leading the pack on one side, and then the West, and ever decreasing West in size, on the other. Now, it should be said that this year, I was actually very optimistic. The year started well. I declared that I was born in the States. I'm an American passport holder. I was actually pleased when Donald Trump left the White House. Credit to him for encouraging us all to recalibrate our views on China, but he certainly damaged the West cohesion. He threatened to leave NATO, and he really wasn't for building coalitions. He was simply, as his big strapline, putting in America first, was such, it was to the detriment perhaps of international cohesion. So the G7 that we had brought together, Joe Biden and other leaders too. America is back. It was perhaps a new resolution for the international community to start to work together to address a long international to-do list, to look at some of the global hotspots that perhaps have been ignored, for too long, and face up and recognize that there is a rising China, and we have to work. We have to find an accommodation with China, but only by working together. And when you work together, China's Achilles heel is not its military might. That is very, very strong indeed. You wouldn't want to pick a fight with it. The difference between this challenge that we face perhaps and the Soviet Union is that China requires trade with the rest of the world. And when you added up the G7 and you expanded it to perhaps include India and South Africa, Australia, and so forth, you're looking at actually just 10, 12 nations equating to over half the world's GDP. Well, if you can get just half of the world's GDP to agree and confirm new trade and security rules, encouraging everybody else to join those rules, that's not a bad step forward to starting to recalibrate a new era of global responsibility. But it's already late in the day to start looking at these concerns as we now enter a period defined as great power competition. The era of US military dominance is over. This will be China's century. We can't get away from that, both from an economic, technological, and military perspective. It will overtake China in its dominance. And for too long, we now recognize that we disregarded where China was going itself. We ignored its human rights, its democratic processes, and absence of international standards in the hope that it was going to mature into this responsible global statesman. That's clearly now not going to happen. And China is pursuing a competing geopolitical agenda, and it's going to clash with the West at some point, and we need to sort this out. Failing to honor the World Trade Organization rules is at the core of this, because what they've cleverly done to advance their own agenda is to ensnare dozens and dozens of countries into its One Belt, One Road programs, into debt traps that they can ill afford. Now, any one of those countries that's then caught up in these debts is unlikely to challenge China at the UN Security Council or indeed at the wider General Assembly for fear of offending it, because they are now subservient to its way of thinking. And that then simply allows China to continue unchecked in pursuing its own agenda. Unfortunately, we are still of the mindset that there's not much we can do about it. We need China's trade, and therefore we need to be careful what we say and what we do. A great example of that is Australia, that dared to challenge China and to say that COVID outbreak, we should have an international investigation. Immediately, China responded by saying, I'm going to slap tariffs on Australian agricultural products. And that's the strength now China is actually illustrating, the fact that it is a state that you do not want to mess with, otherwise there will be repercussions. So China didn't care less so much about Australia. This was a message to all those other smaller countries, poorer countries, that are absolutely subservient and reliant upon the China's economic links. So this is a growing superpower. In my view, it is taking advantage of a timid West. And indeed, you could argue that Cold War II has already begun, but we're in denial to call it out. This time, it's not a buildup of military might, of hardware either side of an Iron Curtain, but it'll be fought on what I think will be two separate fronts. Firstly, that nations are forced to take sides, as I've suggested, and currently China is winning that. It neutralizes countries by ensnaring them into this long-term debt and controlling their states, owning their country's data, and of course paralyzing the international apparatus such as the UN or even the World Health Organization to remove global scrutiny. Secondly, we're actually seeing an aggressive side, and this isn't just China, it's also Russia to some degree as well, of short of war operations. And what do I mean by that? It's by bypassing direct military engagement against us, using cyber weapons to hit our society directly, as every aspect of our lives goes online and therefore is vulnerable. This is the modern battlefield. It's leveraging our very openness and our transparency to hit our society directly. So, attacking our critical national infrastructure, our social media, to sow discord and disagreement. And of course, in the side to that, they're actually aggressively purchasing companies in order to secure technological advantage and logistical advantage as well. And of course, securing economic and intellectual property advantage through influence in Western universities. It's quite an elaborate strategy that China is advancing, and we don't have a strategy. We don't have a view, a collective international view as to how to respond. And I suspect China was actually hoping that the West would continue to turn a blind eye, but its attempt to cover up the COVID outbreak has shone a light on the sort of character that China is now becoming. And the Huawei debate here in the UK was really interesting. Again, the government wanted to include Huawei in our critical national infrastructure here, and it was Parliament, not government. It was the legislative, it was MPs that said, we are not going to have this. We're going to stand up, and we want, to actually check China's, further involvement and grip over Britain. And thankfully, quite wisely, I think we won that. But it was also an illustration, a wake-up call to parliamentarians themselves as to how China uses its own technology as surveillance on its own people, and indeed other nations too. So it's, of course, it's not just China that is of concern. The Chief of the Defense Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, describes the strategic context that we now face as uncertain, as complex and dynamic. It's fast moving. And our rivals want to continuously promote mischief to keep us distracted, to keep us occupied, to keep us divided. Now, I've just been on 2 trips recently. Firstly, to the Warsaw Security Conference. And it wasn't actually China that was the focus there, but for all the reasons I've discussed, you replace China with Russia and what Putin wants to do. And a great example of sowing division is the fact that you've got countries like Germany promoting and supporting Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline, and then you've got some of the Baltic countries saying, no, you need to cut off, you need to have, be able to isolate and separate Russia, otherwise they can actually control our political views and we're not able to stand up to it. So another example of perhaps an absence of international strategy to hold an adventurous, aggressive dictator to account. After I had left Warsaw, I went to Doha in Qatar. And interesting to see that country. It's just had elections in the Shura, taking infant steps towards democracy and greater transparency. But also fascinating, I was the first politician to do this. I met the Taliban. I met Hataki, who is the foreign minister there. And that conjured up the entire issue of extremism. And how do we ensure that a peaceful religion such as Islam, that's created in the 7th century, can actually function in the 21st century, when demands, expectations, including the rights of women, are indeed so different from when the Quran was first written. And if that isn't enough, just to make you all very miserable, of course, we've got outstanding issues such as what's going on in Yemen at the moment, Kashmir, Palestine, Libya, Mali, Lebanon, and Iran. These are all things that over the last 10 to 15 years, with more effort, with more determination, we could have found resolutions for, but for different reasons, we've slid back, and we've allowed these things to fester. And then other actors, mainly Russia and China, then get tucked in there as well. Russia is all over Libya now. Mali, they're sending in proxy organizations called the Wagner Group. And that shows you just how complicated things are getting. You create a vacuum, it will get filled, by adversaries. And that is the way of the world at the moment. So it's this diversity, it's the complexity of these accumulative growing threats, which means it's going to be a bumpy decade. And we need to wake up to that. And that's why it's the importance of alliances is all the more critical. It's why, much as the PM gave an entertaining conference speech, a word salad of energy that came out to rally the party base, it ignored the big issues of the day that the UK and indeed the West is likely to face. And over half the security concerns I've raised here today, if they're not addressed, they will impact on our national security. And our national security and our economic security are 2 sides of the same coin. Our prosperity relies on international communications. It relies on international access. And you remove that access, such as getting into the South China Sea, because China's taken advantage of it, that will impact on the treasury, on the amount of money coming in, and then consequently how much money you have for all the other departments as well. So it's in our interest to take a closer look at this and understand what's going on. Look at how complex and how fragile our economy now is. We've seen the shortage of drivers, and what's that actually caused? It's caused a diversion of ships going now to a different container port in Europe, and that's going to have knock-on consequences. The actual ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal has had implications to British trade as well, and it shows our just-in-time, internationally exposed supply chain requires a security oversight to prevent it from breaking down. And we're not focused enough on recognizing just how vulnerable we are. And if we are vulnerable, it'll be those adversaries that will throw a spanner in the works just deliberately, to cause economic harm, knowing that, again, we'll be distracted so they can go off and do something else. But let me quickly just return to Afghanistan before I sort of close up, because it is a small case study to illustrate where the world is today. It was really sad to see the demise of this state that we'd been so involved with for 20 years, handed back to the very insurgency that we went in to defeat. 2,500 troops, US troops, were helping to retain the status quo. And it was actually the US contractors that worked with them that supplied logistics, including the bullets for the armed forces, that allowed the Afghans to stay on top of things, to actually keep the peace. Yes, it was messy. Yes, it was corrupt. And yes, schoolboy errors were made, such as taking such a long time to start training indigenous troops. But any visit to Afghanistan, and you'll see and witness a genuine societal advance from the 1990s, a new mobile phone owning generation with real expectations, enjoying freedoms accepted in many Muslim states, but now all under threat after the folly of the withdrawal. The decision for Biden to follow Donald Trump's call to bring troops home, always a vote winner, isn't it? To return troops, suggesting a sign of success. But in this case, it was a huge strategic error. And US public opinion now suggests that, seeing what's happened and the dangers unfold, we should have kept troops there. There have been consequences. We've let down 40 million Afghans. We've ceded control to the very insurgency that we went into to defeat. And we once again granted a safe haven potentially for terrorists and terrorist groups to regroup and retrain. And now we see an exodus, of course, of thousands of refugees trying to flee the country. This was far from our finest hour, but all done because the politicians didn't want to turn to their own electorate and spell it out how it was. And just imagine if after the success of defeating the Germans in the Second World War, right after we'd won, we just up sticks and left. Where do you think the Iron Curtain would have ended up? Brushing right next to France. So, we remain committed there for decades. And Germany is now a strong democratic country, very powerful indeed, but it's a safe country and it's an ally. And we just didn't have the strategic patience to stay in a country. I mean, it's just quite ironic, really, because if the argument is that you want to turn to face China and Russia and so forth, well, look where this country sits. It sits between China, Russia, and indeed Iran. These are three of your adversaries. This is a pretty useful piece of the world to stay close to, and yet we've abandoned it. So it's big questions now. It's the reason why I use this as a case study is it's shone light on, what NATO is actually doing now. How can NATO operate without the United States? The reliability of the United States itself to have the patience to see potentially future operations through. And what is the exact purpose of NATO itself? And there's are some questions, I'll be honest about you, between that special relationship between the US and the UK. We were not informed that the US was going to pull out, nor given the opportunity to continue leading ourselves, which arguably we could have done. And as we begin to get our heads around the complex hard power engagement, it begs the question about our ability to deal with the basic post-conflict stabilization. What we're doing in Afghanistan wasn't difficult. The Taliban had AK-47s, they had RPGs, and they had landmines. But we didn't have the patience to hang about and have a better grasp of winning over the hearts and minds. And the consequence of that is that we ended up withdrawing, and that has made the world a more dangerous place as terrorist groups, non-state actors will be buoyed by the humiliation and defeat of a superpower. And to compound matters, you've also got this situation of AUKUS, this announcement in the South China Sea between the United States, Britain, and Australia to have a strategic view to procure submarines, nuclear propulsion, not realizing that actually, in my view, this should have simply been a procurement program and allow the Quad, which is actually Japan, India, United States, and Australia, to move forward, inviting, I would have done, France and Britain to actually join that particular alliance. And yes, Australia, quite in its own rights, to upgrade to a better deal from diesel electric to nuclear propulsion. But ultimately, we just ended up now with France's overreaction, which could have been anticipated, and then our reigniting efforts to advance the EU's security function separate to that work of NATO. So more division across the West. So 2021 draws to a close, and the West seems to be taking one step forward, but 2 steps back. There's a big gap in the market for international leadership, and I really want Britain to step forward and fill that vacuum. And it's so critical for us to be able to think about these things, because what we need to do is recognize that we have that capability. We have the strengths there. As I touched on, they remain strong, but the mood music isn't good. Brexit, as I said, makes us look rather siloed. We've got this bickering over France. Our US-UK relationship needs to be strengthened. Cutting the aid budget is always a poor signal that we are actually serious about doing things on the international stage. But more fundamentally, we lack the ability to generate foreign policy. Whitehall needs to expand its bandwidth if we are serious about moving up a couple notches. Our international departments are too siloed and too risk averse. That was actually reflected in the Afghanistan evacuation. So we need to reinvigorate our ability to do statecraft, to do thought leadership, to offer the solutions that leverage our international hard and soft power, and to rebuild the alliances, the institutions, which could be robust enough to prevent our world splintering into two competing spheres of influence. If Britain doesn't step forward, I pose the question, who will? Jeff, thanks very much indeed. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Tobias. That was a very insightful talk, and also you covered a huge range of topics, which is excellent. We've now got about sort of 50 minutes for questions, so that everyone attending can have the opportunity to ask a question. Those people that want to ask a question via chat, if they send it to my colleague Dr. Kenton White, he will feed in those particular questions. But also, of course, you can just go ahead and ask a question to Tobias. So as I said, we've got about 50 minutes left for questions. So the floor is open. Yes, first question.
Yeah, I've got a question for Tobias. It's when you mentioned that the spending of percentage of GDP on defense during the Cold War was almost double of what it is today, and that perhaps we might be in a more dangerous situation in terms of where the world stands today rather than during the Cold War. Sorry. One of the things that you mentioned when you compared the world to the world in the 1930s was that nations are beginning to rearm, and that's what's making it more dangerous. So how does the idea of raising the GDP from 2% to more, or increasing the percentage of GDP on defense fit into the idea that it's actually the rearming of nations that's making the world more dangerous? I hope I made the question clear, and if I haven't, please ask me again. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I understood the question. I think there's a approach that if we lead by reducing the size of our military capability, others will follow. I'm afraid I think that's a rather naive approach. I think that's actually what the view was in the 1930s, and I'm afraid there are always countries out there, states, non-states as well, that will take advantage of us. And I tried to illustrate the fact that it's happening already. And we've had, on a limited budget, the integrated review. This has actually done a good job in advancing, widening our defenses, because it's cyber and space are now the two new dimensions, in addition to land, air, and sea, in which we have to protect ourselves. But in providing greater space resilience and greater cyber resilience so we can protect ourselves, it's come at a cost. We've had to cut back on the size of our armed force. When you cut back on the size of your armed force, it means you have less of a footprint, less of upstream engagement. If you have less upstream engagement, let's say in a place like Kenya, you're not able to do as much. It's the Chinese that come in. British, the BBC and the World Service has actually departed Kenya. They've been taken over by the Chinese state media to do training with the Kenyans. And that's a great example of, that's why I called it a soft power Cold War, because you need to be able to have general security, to be able to activities, to be able to participate in allowing your trade and the economy and your prosperity to flourish. If you don't have it, I'm afraid bad people will take advantage of it.
Okay, thank you. Kenton, have you got a question you'd like to feed in?
Yes, we've got a question. How does Britain go about rebuilding its hard and soft power, especially after Brexit and the large effects seen from that?
Yeah, big question.
Yeah,
I mean, firstly, firstly on the the post-Brexit side, you have to convince other people that Britain is absolutely committed to doing more on the international stage. And I touched on the fact that cutting your aid budget doesn't help. We need to actually provide solutions into what is going on. Kashmir, for example, we are well placed because of our friendship with both Pakistan and India to lead that conversation. We could have started that 10 years ago. It's not simple. I've studied it. It's complicated. But unless somebody like Britain steps forward, Yemen is another one that should have been resolved a long time ago. There are many fires that could be put out very simply through our leadership, our coordination. But the alliances around the world are breaking down. Now, new alliances are forming and so forth. But ultimately, the rules, the international organizations that have served us well, were created after the Second World War, are now looking very, very dated indeed. So there are many things that Britain can be doing with its soft power to lead the conversation. The United Nations Security Council needs to be upgraded as well. You've got 5 members there as well. It really should be expanded to include, Japan arguably, and Germany as well. Brazil might say the South and Latin American countries should be there too. There needs to be a serious look as to how we hold errant nations to account. And again, until that happens, both Russia and China, with their veto, will know that the United Nations is paralyzed.
Okay, thank you for that. Mike Rockets had his hand up earlier on. Mike Rockets.
Hello, I'm hoping you can hear me. You alluded to lack of engagement with the public and activities in the grey zone below the threshold of war. When do you think that we will engage with the public about our own activities in that grey zone to achieve strategic goals, i.e. using the future commando force or the Ranger regiments that were alluded to coming into being from the latest strategic defence review?
I have to say I'm a bit cynical about those two labels. I mean, I think they're welcome in one sense, but I think we're a bit of gloss to take away from the fact that we were losing 10,000 troops. When you've got, let's take Afghanistan, we rotated regiments, brigades through, and it doesn't matter what brigade it was. It could be 16 Air Assault Brigade, it could be the Royal Marines 3 Commando Brigade, it could be 12 Armoured Brigade. Each brigade was trained in preparation for doing work in Afghanistan, and they did it well. When you start specializing and having a security and assistance brigade and a Ranger brigade as well, or regiments, I don't know how big they're going to be. I think they're going to be much smaller than you think. What do you do after you've sent those in after 6 months? They're going to have to be replaced by someone else. And I'd prefer to see that our entire armed forces being trained to the ability to have that durability, that flexibility, that agility to be able to do different tasks no matter where it actually is. I'm afraid I'm a bit cynical about those terms, those labels. I think, as I said, I think it was just done because it would distract media from the bigger picture of us cutting back on manpower, which is so critical.
Okay, Kenton, have you got another question to feed in from the chat?
I have, but I think Jack has had his hand up for quite a while.
Okay, Jack Dutney.
Yeah, thanks very much. So thanks very much for the talk this afternoon. It's been really interesting. I'm an infantry adjutant, so the question is slightly loaded from that perspective. But Britain, I think, is a trading nation with a cult of commerce. Whilst if reports are to be believed, we're on the verge of cutting the infantry by up to a third. Are we at risk of global Britain being seen as a desperate attempt of finding lucrative new markets, whilst not being taken seriously as a nation with a weakened defence who are not well positioned to be an international leader?
Yeah, I think you touched on it, and if your budget is capped and you suddenly have to do more cyber capabilities, look after your space and protect that, where are the cuts going to be? And they've fallen, I'm afraid, on people. And the argument made by the MOD that, oh yeah, we're going to do all these things by drones and AI and so on, but tech can destroy the enemy, but it can't replace boots on the ground. It couldn't do an evacuation like we saw. The ability to seize and hold ground, or to separate warring factions, or deliver humanitarian aid, restore law and order, or respond to natural disasters. These take people. They take professional people that are trained with the versatility to win over the hearts and minds. And we do it well. And you can't do it if you cut back on the troops.
Kenton, have you got that question to feed in?
Yes. So I've got two questions, but I'll bring the first one in about President Trump's criticism of European members of NATO cutting their military spending. What's your position on that? What's your view on that?
Yeah, he was right on this. I mean, if there is a tilt to the Pacific that the Americans were, wanting to focus on, then you want Europe to look after its own. And we've got to deal with the fact that we've got our own challenges here with Russia. I mentioned that. And we've got some nations that still aren't committed to what all NATO countries should be, and that's that minimum of 2% indeed. So, he was right on that. The idea that somehow that you pull funding back and then make Europe more vulnerable actually is counterintuitive. It's not the strategic way. I think the most influential way to make it happen, because all you do is make Europe more dangerous, which gives another part of the world concern for Americans to worry about. So I think there are cleverer ways of getting European nations, NATO members, to up their game.
Okay, I've got another couple of questions come through. The follow-on to that one was, what could the potential impact of an independent Scotland be on the future of Britain's global security? And basically, I guess, Britain's the view that we're talking about of global Britain.
Yeah, I mean, there's an operational massive question to do with what you do with the nuclear submarines. I've been surrounded by I mean, that can be managed, because if we went down this route, then I'm sure there would be arrangements made. But it would, I think, both for Scotland and England, it would make us all look weaker. We are stronger as a union. I think the Scotnats, I mean, they make the case for independence, but they're also good at running, Scotland up there, which is why they win elections, and the other parties need to recognise that. Whether the Scotland itself would want to go whole hog and go for independence itself, knowing that you would be a very small entity, and then you'd then be, absolutely then reliant on England, it really does. I think it will focus minds, and I suspect that it'll be close, but more people will want to stay in rather than leave.
Okay, the next one is, we're coming back to Afghanistan. How would you respond to Biden's argument that the result would have been the same, whatever stage America withdrew from there?
I don't agree with that at all. I think I made that point very clear. Yes, there were some fundamental errors. We should have invited conversations with the Taliban back in 2001. In fact, they approached Donald Rumsfeld and he told them to sod off. He said, no, we're the winners. You're the losers. Go away. What a mistake that was. Imagine if they'd been invited to the Bonn talks back in 2001, and that didn't that didn't happen. But more to the point, though, you've just ceded ground, important ground. China will then move in, potentially as in to finance the Taliban, and with scant regard for human rights and so forth. Taliban have already shown that they don't have full command over ISIS-K, this terror group based down in Jalalabad area, and it's just made for a very messy area, and in a critical part of the world. It was the wrong call, and I think he knew that. He's been consistent, I have to say, maybe marred by Vietnam in wanting to depart, but I think he thought there would just be a couple of weeks bad headlines and then that would be it. But instead, the world certainly is a more dangerous place because of this. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, I've got a question from Ellie H.
Hi, yeah. My question is still kind of linked to Afghanistan and linked to this idea of what plans were made for leaving. It has very much come across that there was never a plan really properly formulated, which I, as someone who I come from a very military heavy family, and I know that when it comes to having plans, there is nearly always a plan. Was it really the case that we had not even thought over 20 years, we did not even think about the possibility that the Taliban could come back into power in some way? I would say it's still a shock that they managed to come back as quickly and as prominently as they have. But was it really never, were they really not seen as a threat after we got rid of them? Was it really not looked at properly in depth? Was that part of the problem that's led to this, as you put it, folly of removal?
Yeah, there's some really good questions there. I mean, there's a lot to learn, which is why I've wanted an inquiry as to what we did. You know, you take over a country like this, what is your plan? And you had military people who have told me on evidence, on oath, that they didn't understand the difference between Sunni and Shiite. And yet they were then put in charge of running this country. And we didn't learn enough and understand about Afghan history. And this is, given Britain's been there, this is the fourth time, you know, that we've been involved there. And we didn't check our notes and say, my goodness, this is a very disparate country, tribally structured, where power bases are down on a local level. You can't run the country from Kabul, and that's what we tried to do. We then spent 5 years, a delayed 5 years, before we even started training an Afghan force. Now, what a waste of the first 5 years. And as I mentioned, we told the Taliban to go away. They crossed the border into Pakistan to rearm. And we didn't deal with Pakistan in the way that perhaps, you know, we should have, with a bit more confidence and assertiveness. And the consequences is a bunch of schoolboy errors which led to this. But like I said, it was tentatively going in the right direction. So, you know, we still have troops in Cyprus. We still have troops in other parts of the world. They offer assurance. They offer stability. And the consequence of pulling them out is greater than keeping those troops in there. And to, as I said, you know, in Germany after the Second World War, you know, we still have troops in Germany today. And it's a wise thing to do. We could have easily have kept going. Instead, as I said, it turned into a political football in the United States during the presidential elections, with Trump saying, I'm going to bring these boys home. Nobody had actually been killed, you know, from a combat perspective since 2014. We fed the wrong message to the American people, and to some degree the British people as well, to say what good work we're actually doing and why it was wise to stay there. But to advance the governance structure, to create a more federated model, that's what the place needed.
Okay, I'll bring several questions together and ask about what your view is on filling the vacuum, as you mentioned, with China and Russia having talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also Russian intervention in Libya and Syria. How do you see the situation developing in the region more generally in terms of this developing Cold War?
Firstly, in answer to all these things, you need a collective strategy. You need countries to come together to look in the same direction. And as long as we're not looking in the same direction, then the challenges in all the areas that you mentioned are able to get worse. So Russia is able to exploit differences across Europe because we're not cohesive enough in working out what to do, particularly about supply chains and oil and gas and so forth. What's interesting about Russia is that China is a different case. I think Russia is an acute challenge. China is the long-term one. And there's a big question there as to whether Russia itself, you could turn Russia around. I mean, naturally, it looks to the West. They prefer, I think, to look this way. And for different reasons, they're ending up working more closely with China. That's not a natural fit. And ultimately, they will end up being the subservient country as well. They would be taken over eventually by China's thinking. So for me, there is, perhaps it'll be easier to deal with China if you can then turn Russia 180 degrees. And that requires some clever thinking. And on China, again, I said, China's Achilles heel is trade. They can, if we are more robust in our trading standards and policy, international standards, then China's behavior will change because it will have to, because they won't be able to support their own country. But we're too diversified at the moment in thinking of it may require us, that Sputnik moment to recognize, what China is all about. And when I say China, I say Beijing, not the Chinese people, because when you tuck underneath and see, the country, there are differing views there. But most people's understanding of China is a rather modern view. I mean, step back and look how China was treated by us during the century of humiliation. How did we get Hong Kong in the first place? And you can understand some of the anger China has towards us. And that needs to be factored in how we actually deal with them today.
Okay, and I'll paraphrase the next couple of questions as well. You've touched on Britain's economic dependence on countries like China. How do we deal with that, and how do we sell that to the British public, the taxpayers, in terms of resilience and a longer-term benefit for the nation? Well,
we want to become a high-tech superpower ourselves. The government has made that very, very clear, and I think that's the right direction to go. We're very much services-driven. We've got the high-tech capabilities, so we need to be indigenous in that way. We need to be less reliant on other countries, or certainly reliant on countries that we can rely upon ourselves. And we need to make political judgment calls. Are you going to tolerate how the Uyghurs are treated? Are you going to tolerate what's happening in Hong Kong? Are you just going to turn a blind eye to these things, or are you going to take a stand? And at the moment, China's benefiting from this because nobody is willing to take a stand. And as we look towards the Quad and AUKUS and so forth, we are starting to realize that China can't have it all its own way. So we do need to be more constructive, I think, in our strategy on where we go forward.
Any other questions? Tobias, could I come in with a question really? It's often said that the special relationship has got sort of three pillars to it that kind of keep it going. I suppose there's the intelligence relationship, there's the nuclear relationship, and the relationship between the three armed forces in this country and the United States. And many commentators have said that actually, with a combination of the Trump administrations and then Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, that we shouldn't talk about the special relationship anymore because it was always more special in London than it was in Washington. And with your sort of dual nationality and your perspective, do you think that the phrase special relationship we should just sort of put in the dustbin of history? Is it redundant, or has it still got life left in it?
No, it is a critical relationship, and it is beneficial to the Americans, and we need to absolutely continue to prove that it's worth having. I went at some length to say that we have a reach and understanding of the world, a grasp of what's going on, and that's because of our intelligence services, our diplomatic footprint, and indeed our armed forces as well. We make an effort to appreciate the detail, the granular detail of what's going on. The Americans are not as good as that as we are. They know that. They like to call us up and say, what do you think about this situation in this particular neck of the woods, and get our views on it. But we can only offer a sensible view if we're seen as relevant and if we're seen as current in what's going on. And that slid back a bit. The Brexit piece as well. You know, are we the go-to people in Europe to get Europe's viewpoint on this? You know, that's changed a little bit as well. And there's also the personal one. You're right to focus on the intelligence, the military, the nuclear. Absolutely second to none. That's critical. But there's also the personal relationship as well. And Donald Trump and Boris Johnson clearly were pushing a political agenda. And I think Donald, if we're honest about it, Joe Biden had a different view of this. But Joe Biden's a professional, as is indeed Boris Johnson. And the more time they spend together, the more that can advance as well. I'm glad the Atlantic Charter was upgraded, you know, this summer. But I repeat that we've got a lot more work to do to earn our place. So, you know, we have somebody in the back channels, particularly political back channels are not there at the moment. I know that for a fact, and they need to be improved so that we can talk to each other. It is, you know, the special relationship goes back to the Second World War. Field Marshal Sir John Dill who's the only Brit that's buried in Arlington Cemetery. And he was the one that was able, you know, through Churchill to be able to speak directly to Dulles and Marshall, the key people that were planning the D-Day landings and so on. You know, Calais, not such a great idea. Why don't we do a feint there? Well, let's do it down in Normandy. You know, you guys are on the ground there. We'll take your advice on that. And, you know, that's where it's all started from. And I really want to see that rekindling critically, because that, for me, is the foundation from which you then get other nations in to then create that alliance that we need to do to stand up to some of these gargantuan challenges that we're going to confront us over the next decade.
So you still think I should use the phrase special relationship in tutorials then and lectures? It's worth hanging on to.
Well, I think it's whether it's special in the word special itself, but when you say special relationship, everybody knows what you mean. You know, it's like a Ford Escort. You know what a Ford Escort is now. Yeah. So from that perspective, I think it's useful.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? Kenton, have you any questions to feed in?
Yes. I think I can sum up a couple more questions. You've mentioned the 1930s and the situation, what the similarities are. Is Taiwan going to be the modern equivalent of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland? Are we going to see the same sorts of problems develop? And what will the outcome be for a NATO that is politically quite divided even now?
So there's a really interesting comparison with history, because I don't think that Taiwan is going to be the hill that we die on. Again, if you know your history with Chiang Kai-shek as to how, you know, the Taiwan gained its semi-independence after the communists, you know, took control. It's ambiguous, and the people there as well in Taiwan, there are, you know, around half the population are not looking for independence. They are, but they don't want to be taken over by China, but they do want a relationship with China. So it is complicated. It's more the point that you've got China that's just asserting itself and going against the grain. It's the 9 dotted line, which I think is the bigger concern, with the militarization of various reefs and atolls, which absolutely do not belong to China in any form, in any modern understanding, and the freedom of the seas as well, but also the more subtleness in the way that they are sucking up influence across the world, that needs to be checked. So, you know, there is a wake-up call to be done by the West. I've stressed that during this talk today, but at the moment there doesn't really seem to be the appetite there.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, we've got no more in the chat.
Okay, well, if everybody is done, I will start to kind of draw the meeting to a close. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of everyone at Reading and those people who have joined us of thanking Tobias Ellwood for giving up his time. And
sorry, Jeff. Olivia's got her hand up.
Okay, sorry, one more question.
Yes, sorry. Hello, thank you for your presentation today. You mentioned leadership on several occasions, a deficit and decline of leadership in the West, and namely Britain. I'm not certain whether you were referring to individual leaders in particular, but what sort of state leadership do you hope for in the future for Britain and generally in the West, especially with other leaders like Putin and President Xi in mind?
Well, you need to coordinate international effort. I made that clear myself. But also, if this is to be what Britain does, then we need to look at our construct for leading. And we're not producing the statecraft. I'll be honest, in Parliament, we're not producing the level of grasp of understanding of international matters that will then, produce the ministers and so forth that would be required if we were to step into this space with the vigor that I would like to see. That's not to say it's not unchangeable, but there was a time when I've just come from Doha. We used to have what we call the camel corps in the Foreign Office, people, Arabists that absolutely understood what was going on in that neck of the woods, and that's we don't have that same level of that appetite, that desire to have that grasp and understanding. It's still there, as I say, the ingredients are still there, but it's not done with the same vigor, and that's what I think would need to improve were we to take on this a more enhanced role on the international stage.
Okay, any other questions? Final call? Okay, well, as I said, I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of everybody at Reading of thanking Tobias Ellwood for giving up his time. We've got, hang on, I keep on getting more questions. They're coming in late. Have we got one more question? No. So again, just
sorry.
Hello.
Hello. I just wondered that what do you think? Do you think China will invade Taiwan? As you know, just China came there. If they think the unified Taiwan is their mission.
Well, unified. It is clear that is their mission. There's no doubt about it. China made that very, very clear, indeed. I think if they did it by force, they would find themselves facing an insurgency. Not only that, but it will be the wake-up call for the West as to further recalibrate their views on the sort of country that China is when it's willing to use force and ignore the fact that actually it's for Taiwan itself, the people of Taiwan, to determine their own future. It would be interesting to see what happens with the Americans, what their policy will be. But I think Taiwan is just one aspect of a growing sense of assertiveness that China is exerting across the world, and that is the bigger issue that the West will need to contend with.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah, we've got to see one more hand there.
Hello. Thank you for your session. It's really informative. I had a question. When can we consider, we have seen that many countries have used cyber warfare in multiple situations, but when can we consider a cyber act as a use of force?
Well, we're currently creating the Cyber Security Centre actually in the north of England as we speak now. But for me, sitting in Parliament is an interesting question, because if you were to use military hard power to go into Syria, for example, there would be a vote in Parliament. When it comes to cyber attacks, or even receiving a cyber attack, it's not so open or in the public domain yet, and that's a big question as to how does Article 5, NATO Article 5, fit into this new form of warfare. I don't think culturally society has had a full debate yet. It's still such a fast-moving phenomena, and exposure. Our response normally to cyber attacks is just to build greater resilience, to build up the walls, rather than doing that, which is necessary, but also having a wider debate as to how do you, if you're able to point the finger, which institution do you go to say, I've just received a cyber attack, the world should start putting sanctions on that country because this is what they did. We're not in that place yet.
Okay. Any other questions? Kenton, last call. Any more questions in the chat?
No more questions there, Jeff.
Okay. Well, I think, again, third time lucky, I'm going to try and thank Tobias Ellwood for, I think, giving up his time and giving us a really good talk and answering questions on a huge spectrum of topics. So very many thanks. I'd like to also thank all the people who've taken the time to attend this first seminar of this series, and particularly all the students on the Army Higher Education pathway, and I hope you've enjoyed it. By way of just a kind of slight plug before we end, this academic year, this is for our undergraduates and MA students, we're actually running a film series, and the next one is on the 18th of October at 6 p.m. in the Van Emden Theatre. It's The Fog of War. It's about Robert McNamara talking about the Vietnam War, and the inducement that we have. Also, you get if you turn up, you get a free pizza. What else can I say? And also, can I just draw people's attention to the next meeting in this seminar series, which is going to be the 10th of November. And we have Professor Caroline Kennedy Pipe, who is Professor of International Relations and International Security at the University of Loughborough. And the title of her talk is Reflections on Afghanistan. So I'm sure we touched upon it numerous times today, and we're perhaps going to explore it in even more detail in our next meeting. So that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you for giving up your time, and we hope that we'll see you all on the 10th of November. Thank you. Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.